3, 2, 1, go.
Hello, and welcome to this talk about Cypress. Before I get going, I wanted to let you all know that we have a number of open positions in Houston. As you can see on the screen, I'm not going to read them out for you because there's kind of a lot of them. We also have some in Minneapolis. If you or anyone you know is qualified for these positions, do please pass your resume on to careers@improving.com. So let's get going. My name is Chapman Baetzel, and today I'll be talking about Cypress, tips and tricks. I use Cypress a lot in my daily life, and these are the things I do with it. First off, I want to let you know that Cypress is really easy to install. I recently walked a coworker through this, and he is not comfortable with the command line at all. So I'm here telling him exactly what to type over a Skype call, and we were able to get Cypress installed. How many frameworks would you want to install that way? Probably not many, but we did it. First, you have to have Node installed, but that's also pretty easy. If you can install any kind of software, you can install Node. It's just a package installer. Once that's done, it's a single command to install Cypress. That's all you have to do. Now, for my application of Cypress, I've got a number of plugins going, and those are all one command line installers, just like Cypress. In our environment, we use Cypress failed log, Cypress XPath, and Cypress wait until, which do pretty much what the names sound like. Cypress failed log puts the log of the test into the command line on any failed test. Cypress XPath lets you use XPath selectors, and Cypress wait until lets you wait for things you can't normally wait with the Cypress wait command, which I'll cover later. So get is the most important Cypress command. It's really the heart of Cypress. You've got to access the elements somehow. Before you can manipulate something, clicking or typing into a field, you've got to get that field or button or link or whatever. Get is how you do that. One of Cypress' claims to fame is the readability, and so your selectors is one of the big ways that Cypress is readable. Now, this example here is not the most readable in the world. What is a class FAS? I don't know, but if we read a little further, we see it's a chevron double right. So from that, we can deduce that it's something to do with a double right chevron, maybe an icon, and that's what this is doing. It's clicking an icon. The best way to have readable and functional selectors is with data sci attributes. These are attributes added by development that don't do anything to the item on the page itself, but do make our lives easier by uniquely identifying the element on the page. And if something about that element changes, say the class changes to a chevron double left, then a data sci attribute would be constant and let us continue to get that element. It's also very robust to use data sci elements just for that reason. When I don't have them, which is most of the time, I usually default to getting something by class. And if that isn't unique enough, I'll go with data bind. I usually find that's enough to uniquely identify the item on the page. Now, something you should know about Cypress commands in general is that it retries every couple of milliseconds until the command timeout is reached. That means if you can't get the item on the page the first time it goes through the DOM, it's going to keep retrying. And I think that's just lovely. Selector Playground. I don't find this to be incredibly useful, but it is included with the Cypress runner. A clever little feature, it lets you poke through the elements on screen and have a selector automatically generated that will pretty much always be able to find your element. I say pretty much because sometimes that doesn't work. If you notice here, the selector includes a GUID. Now, that GUID is going to be different the next time I run this test, because test data is generated on the fly for this test in an effort to make our test data agnostic. That is, not caring about what data exists in the environment beforehand. It just generates its own data at the start of the test. I'll get into how it does that just a little later. So the Selector Playground gives you a selector just by mousing over and clicking an element. The other problem I have with it is the readability. Ignoring the GUID, what is an nth child kn deflex? That doesn't make a lick of sense to me. I have no idea what it's trying to find, but sometimes you can't find any other way to select an element, and the Selector Playground is usually my backup option when it comes to generating selectors. It works, but it ain't pretty. I'll give you just a quick demo of the Selector Playground right here. So this is the Selector Playground. You click this button up here, and that brings it open. And then as long as the mouse icon is blue, it's going to let you generate selectors. Now, I don't see a single one of these on the page that looks like something I'd want to use, but sometimes I've got to. I mean, what are these even indicating? Nth child 4, nth child 2, K widget, K dropdown. I mean, dropdown, I can assume it's a dropdown selector, but the rest of that is just gobbledygook because I'm not a developer. Anyway, back to our slideshow. Contains. It's like get, only slightly better in the way I use it. See, now normally, when you're using get in this bit of code here, they look like they're the same. We've got label in both of them and contains material in both of them. However, when I'm using get label this way, it's going to get all the labels on the page. And that is going to it'll search that list of labels for anyone that contains material. Now there's just one problem with that, and that's in the time it takes to render the page. If the label I want that contains material isn't rendered at the time get gets all the labels, it's not going to retry the get, just the contains. The second use of it, where I do just get sci contains here, where I do just sci contains, is going to research all the labels for one that has material each time it retries it. And that's what I need when the label isn't on the page because of rendering issues. And I'll show you where I use this in another demo. See here, I've got this label for material. And if you look right here, it's the label material. Now what I really want is this span down here, but nothing uniquely identifies it except for the value in it. And if I'm testing the value in it, that's not really going to work for me, especially if I'm testing and it's got the same value as something else on the page. That'll give me a false positive. So what I do is I get the label and then search from that label to find the span. I'll show you how I do that just a few more slides. So within is actually the way I do that. It's a great command and I use it all the time. It restricts your get operation to only those elements under a certain element in the DOM. As you can see here in the element inspector view, I have an input field which is just a huge messy set of attributes. And it's not the only one on the page that looks exactly like this. I could build a selector that grabs this input, but I'd also get 87 more of them, and there's no real way for me to distinguish it. I could use the Selector Playground to get that selector, but maybe there's a better way. The label of that input is unique on the page, but that is quite away from the input field. But we can grab the parent of that label, which is in that whole section, and then scope our get to what is underneath it. And there we go, we get our input field. And the end result is something that's pretty readable. Sci contains label, representative carry fluid, get its parent, go within, and then a get with an input that's visible. And then I can type Steam, which is what I wanted to do with the get anyway, or the input. Show you what that looks like. When I've got that label right here, I've got the label, and then its parent is this div class, which I'm distinguishing by the fact that it's a parent. And then I go down, span, another span, and there's the input I want. Look at that huge, huge mess of code. There it is. So you have to know how to get around in the DOM. Getting parents and children, siblings, is all very much important when selecting elements in Cypress. You have to watch out though, because some things will only work if it's got a single element, like clicking or typing. And some of these DOM navigation commands can return one or many. Siblings and children, for example, could be one or many elements. So I like to tuck a first or a last on the end of those to ensure I'm only getting one. Ideally, I would have enough information in the selector to make sure I only get one, but I'd still use first and last just in case something new popped up. Clicking. This is what the user is going to be doing. It's really the most essential element of user interaction, at least in a GUI-based program. I use these almost as much as I used get. Now, force clicking is not what you might think it is, despite my cute baby Yoda. Sometimes an element I've gotten is actually behind an element that's the same size and in the same location. In this instance, I can't actually click on it because it's hidden. What I can get is the area where it's in and force the click on that, which is what force clicking does. It gets the coordinates of the element that's hidden behind something else and just clicks in the center. Should, the then of your given when then. It's the assertion of Cypress. What can I say about should? Every test should have a should in it. 99% of my tests use should exist, which is implied by the get, because get will error out if it fails to find what it's looking for. But I use should exist anyway, just so that the log makes it clear that that was what I was testing for. But there's a lot of things you can should on. You can should visible, should not exist, should greater than, should be equal to, and then supply it with a parameter that you're expecting it to be equal to. The list is really, really long, and I haven't used most of them in my work with Cypress, but they're there. Invoke. It's a neat little thing I've recently learned how to use. It lets you run functions on elements in the DOM. So far, the only function I use it to run are val and remove attribute. The former I use to get the value of an input field so I can assert on it, as you can see in this code snippet here. The latter I use to make a link not open in a new browser window, because Cypress doesn't like when you do that. If you open a new browser window, Cypress won't have any idea what it is, and your test basically won't run anymore. So that's what I'm doing here, removing the attribute target, which forces that link to open in the same window that Cypress is operating on. Request is another great command that I use in all of my tests. It's how I log into the app, for one thing. So every test does it. And almost every test creates its own test data. I use requests for that too. I tried creating test data in the GUI through clicking and typing, and it took 8 minutes to run. That's 8 minutes for every test, and right now I have over 200 of them. It's an unacceptable amount of time spent. Anyone want to guess how long it takes using request? Less than 8 seconds. Usually between 4 or 5, depending on how much test data I'm creating. Cypress is supposed to be fast, and when they hold the development deployments up waiting for my test automation to finish, those few seconds per test really count. Right now it takes almost an hour for the suite to finish, and that's with 7 different jobs running a group of tests in parallel. And that's one reason why I want my tests to create their own test data, so they don't trip over each other operating on the same data while running in parallel. Now you might ask how I figured out what the request needs to be and look like in order to program test data into Cypress. Well, I used Fiddler to snoop on the traffic going from my UI to the back end. I really wish we had a documented API, but we don't, so I'm stuck using Fiddler and snooping. Root is a great command that watches for calls that come back, matching the string you specify. Here I'm looking for get by ID. I use it here with an alias to return the value so I can use it just a little later. I'm watching for the return call from open specific assessment, and once I get it, I can do things with the response body as you see here. I need to get this asset ID and the response ID, which I just call regular ID, to make it more distinguished, because I need both of those in create CML reading. Then is also an important Cypress command. Without then, I wouldn't be able to act on the return values of a request, and I need to be able to do that. See where I get the scenario ID in the snippet here? That only works because it's in a then on the create test scenario. I use a then to encapsulate the rest of the test, but that's just for my own readability. I would love for a way to get the scenario in the before function and have it accessible to an after where my test cleanup would go. As of right now, all my test setup and cleanup has to be inside that then because it uses the scenario ID. You can see create test scenario, that's my setup method. Scenario in our application is basically a copy of the entire environment. You can do whatever you want in the scenario and not mess up anything for anyone else. So I make one for each individual test and do the test inside of it, then I delete the scenario when I'm done, assuming the test passes, of course. I can tell when I've had a bad run in our ADO pipeline by how many dangling scenarios I've got left in the environment afterwards. Sometimes it's 100 or more. Commands are like the shorthand of Cypress. You can put a bunch of lines of Cypress code inside a command and give it a nice, easy to read name, and that's the best use case for commands. Sure, you could also encapsulate every commonly used function this way, but that's not recommended. Cypress doesn't want you to make commands for click button, for example, because sci_get_button.click should be readable enough. The second command here is for clicking a non-unique button on a page. It has to mouse over the button first to make it clickable, and then it can click on it. And as you can see, there's a lot of DOM navigation in that command, and I don't really want that appearing in every single test case.
Got a question for you.
Yeah?
Says, any good reason to use Fiddler over the Network tab in the browser's DevTools?
I don't know, really. I'm just used to using Fiddler for snooping. So that's what I went to. When I was doing API testing, it was Fiddler and Postman. I never really used the network tab in Chrome or any other browser to get calls. So it's just what I'm used to. It's really the best answer I've got. So moving on to wait. Wait is another command that I use frequently, although I shouldn't use it the way I use it. I wait most often for an arbitrary amount of seconds, which is an anti-pattern. It's in big, bold letters on the Cypress documentation for wait not to do it that way. Don't do it. I do it because of animations. Animations can't be detected any way I know how because everything they're working on is already on the page. But if I try to click one of those elements, by the time it executes the click, the object has already moved and it will miss the location of that object. Or some dialog box is already fading out, and the next thing I want is already on the page, but behind the transparency layer, and it's obscured, so it won't be able to click on it. It'll get an error. I could force click it, but the control is still inactive until that modal dialog box finishes fading out. I usually only have to wait half a second or so for the animation to finish, so it's not really that bad. If I ever find myself waiting for more than a second, I really try hard to find another way. Some other control I can assert on or get that will indicate when the thing I'm waiting for is finished. I'm not always able to find it, but I do try. And here, I'm waiting for that response from Open Specific Assessment to come back. And I've showed you this code snippet before, so I can create a CML reading getting the IDs off that response. Oh, conditionals. They're kind of the bogeyman of Cypress. Cypress says you shouldn't have them at all because conditionals make a test non-deterministic. If you're doing an if-then in your test, then you really have two branches of test code logic. And if you have a conditional in a test, you're pretty much admitting that that test is flaky. It could be this way, or it could be the other way, and we don't know which it will be at test execution. Cypress was designed around the idea of eliminating this kind of flakiness completely. But they will begrudgingly admit that sometimes you have to use conditionals, and then there at the bottom of their article about them is a code snippet on how to use them. I use them because our Azure DevOps pipeline kind of is terrible. It runs slower than my machine, and I can't imagine why. These servers are supposed to be like top-end supercomputers, and yet my personal PC can run Cypress faster. I don't understand it. But I've learned to live with it by using conditionals, mainly on the loading spinners. Our application takes time to communicate between the front and the back end, and when that happens, there's a loading spinner or animation. The loading spinner will appear and disappear, and that is what the test is programmed to wait for. Spinner visible, then spinner not visible. Then the test continues on without timing out, trying to get a look at whatever the spinner was hiding. But sometimes the back end will respond very quickly, and the test won't start looking for the spinner until that spinner has already disappeared. When this happens, the test will fail and generate a false negative. I'm not testing for spinner visibility, but I am looking for it. And the test will fail nonetheless when get is unable to find that spinner. So I use a conditional. It basically says, if there's a spinner, we wait for it. And if not, we jog on. I don't really care about the spinner existing or not. Oh wait, I read that already. Sorry, I've lost my notes. Oh well. I have a brief demo and then there'll be time for questions. So I'm going to show you what it looks like running Cypress. This is the Cypress runner, which loads up when you launch Cypress. It's got a list of all my tests here, and they're in folders. And when we click on a test, it comes up in a window like this and runs. And I'm just going to rerun this test, and we can walk through what it's doing. So first, I log in, which is invisible because it's just using a request. Then it's generating the test data. It's navigating to an assessment, entering in some data in the assessment. There's that saving spinner it was waiting for. And enters some more data on this shared fields here of this COF assessment. Here it's waiting for that dialog box, which appeared and disappeared really quickly, and now it's done. So you can see here at the end it's deleting a scenario, but we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. So like I said, it visits the login page and then sends a request which amounts to logging in. Then my tests all generate this unique test ID, which it uses to uniquely distinguish the various bits of test data in the test. So I've got my scenario, which is identified by this unique ID here. Then it creates the scenario, which is this request. It waits for this message, which indicates scenario is finished being created. So you can see this toaster pop up right over here. Then it creates all my test data, which is an area, a unit, a system, a subsystem, and then an asset, which is what it operates on. It creates some other stuff it doesn't need to. I should probably get rid of that. Then it opens this thing up here at the top. You can see the click, which opens up this configuration menu. Goes to scenario options and clicks on it. Then from here it goes to the calculation settings and clicks on that. Operating on this label, it gets the parent, which is this whole row, then scopes to within it and gets the input, just like I said I did with within. It selects all and types 0, because that's the condition of this test, is when this is 0, a certain thing should happen. So then it goes to the save button up here at the top right, visits the default page, which is scenario assessment, searches in the search box for that unique ID, which you can see here in the log. It's opening that unique ID of the assessment. Here it's typing it in. And then it double clicks on the first result that contains that string, which will open up our assessment. It waits for the loading banner, which you can kind of see. It's sort of faded, but it exists there. This is it searching for the existence of the loading banner, and then it waits for it to disappear. See, expecting it not to be visible, so it's not visible anymore. Then this is that chevron double right I talked about in the beginning. It's just closing this side pane. So you can see that side pane, which makes it a lot easier to click elements in the middle here because the side pane is not squishing things. Should let me open that. Huh. So then I'm going to details and I click the edit button. It does have to force click on details and I'm not entirely sure why. Then this getting of a modal content is actually getting this edit dialog box, which opens up, and it has to scope to within that for the next couple of commands because the labels are not unique. You see the labels here on the details main page are the same as the labels that would appear in the edit dialog. Not all of them show. They don't show if they've just at default values. They only show if they've been changed in our application, but all of them show in the edit screen. So then it's getting the input and typing aluminum. It's then going to outlet temperature and entering 250. Operating pressure, entering 150, and then it saves this. It's going to our COF assessment tab, and here's that horrible bit of code where I navigate through the DOM in an ugly fashion because it has to get the parent all the way up 3 levels before it can scope to within and get this whole section here in order to click this add button. And as you can see, there's 3 add buttons on this page, so it really has to scope it to within this HSC block. HSE block, not HSC. And it grabs the 581 level 1 personnel injury option and opens this modal content dialog, which we don't have to edit anything on, but it pops up as soon as you add that card. Save and close. Wait for the saving banner, which you can kind of see faded here because that's the animation. It's fading in before it finishes rendering, and then it'll fade out. But the point at which Cypress grabbed it, it was still fading in. Oh, and here I wait 2 seconds, probably for that animation to fade. I shouldn't be waiting 2 seconds. Anyway, so I grab this board up here at the top, open up the menu item, and then I grab shared fields, which will switch the screen to this page. Then I grab the edit button and click it, which opens this dialog. Come on, where's the dialog? There it is. It's finding all this stuff before the dialog is finished rendering, which is kind of strange as I walk through it. And as you can see, the element's not visible as it finds it. But then it gets visible here and waits for it to be visible. That's really weird. Anyway, enter some values in this dialog box. I'm not going to go through all of them because they're just like the ones we've looked at before. Types in 2000. Here, it's after saving, it's going to open up this ellipsis, waiting for it to be visible before it clicks it, because that will guarantee that the modal dialog has faded. And then it runs our susceptibility and COF calculations, which pops up a "Are you sure you want to run them?" which we click yes on. And then wait 100 milliseconds for this dialog to fade. And then we wait for another button yes, which I don't know if you recall, it took a couple of seconds for this to appear while the test was running. We have to wait and can't do this button yes immediately after the other button yes, or else it'll find this one twice, and that's not what we want. It won't then wait for this one to appear, which we need it to appear, so it'll refresh the page with our calculation results. So then we go back to shared fields, or actually we open the shared fields menu, which lets us go back to the board, and we click on our card, which now opens up with results. We can see them. There we go. We can see the results which weren't there before because we're checking for the personal, these fields to be NA is what we're looking for, and this result to be 0. So that is what that test did. When the, let's see, what field was that we set to 0 in the beginning? I've been walking through it. Injury cost per person is set to 0, then personnel injury risk is going to be 0 because it costs nothing for a person to get hurt. So that's what this test does. Now, are there any questions?
I do not have any questions in the queue.
No? Okay. Well, I hope you all enjoyed my talk about Cypress. I guess y'all can have back half an hour of your lunch. I'm getting a network error.